The morning Emma Walker's father coughed up blood for the first time. She had been standing at the kitchen window, watching the sun rise over the Kansas plains, thinking that the world had never looked more beautiful or more cruel. And she had no idea then that both of those things were about to become absolutely true in equal measure. That was 4 years ago, in the autumn of 1878, when the grasslands were the color of old honey and the wind came down from the north with its first cold teeth. Emma had been 22 then, living with her father on a modest homestead outside the small town of Harlan's Creek, a cattle and farming community that sat like a speck of dust on the vast flat table of western Kansas. She had been engaged to a man named Robert Caldwell, a merchant's son from town who wore clean shirts and had soft hands and talked about building a proper house with glass windows. She had been, by most measures, on the ordinary path that most young women of that time and place were expected to walk. Then her father, Samuel Walker, had coughed blood onto the white handkerchief he kept folded in his breast pocket, and the path dissolved beneath her feet like sugar in a spring flood. The doctor in Harlan's Creek, an old man named Phelps who smelled of pipe tobacco and liniment, had come out to the homestead 2 days later and listened to Samuel's chest with his wooden stethoscope. He had straightened up slowly, the way old men do when they are carrying news that is too heavy to move quickly with, and he had told Emma that her father had tuberculosis. Consumption, people called it, as though the disease were a kind of hunger, eating from the inside out. Dr. Phelps had told her that there was no cure he knew of, that some men lasted months and some lasted years, and that the best thing she could do was keep Samuel comfortable and fed and rested. He had said it with kindness, but kindness does not soften certain kinds of edges. Robert Caldwell had come to the homestead 3 weeks after the diagnosis, hat in hand, his soft face arranged into an expression of deep sorrow that Emma later understood was not really sorrow at all but the performance of sorrow, the kind of expression a man wears when he is about to do something selfish and wants to believe he is being noble. He told her he loved her. He told her he was sorry. He told her he simply could not wait an unknown number of years for her to be free to marry him, that his own future could not be held in suspension, that he hoped she understood. He had ridden away down the dirt road before the dust his horse raised had even settled, and Emma had stood in the yard watching him go with her arms folded across her chest, as though she were trying to hold herself together from the outside. She did not cry. Not then. She would cry later in the dark of her own room, quietly, so as not to disturb her father. But standing in that yard, watching Robert Caldwell grow smaller and smaller until he disappeared over the low rise of the road, she felt something change inside her. Something closed, and something else opened. She was not sure yet what either of those things was, but she felt it happen, the way you feel a door swing shut behind you even when you cannot see it. In the years that followed, Emma became someone the people of Harlan's Creek regarded with a particular kind of respectful distance. She was the woman who nursed her father. She was the woman who kept the homestead running alone. She hauled water from the well before dawn, and tended the small vegetable garden, and kept a few chickens, and traded eggs for flour and coffee at the general store in town. She learned to mend the fence line herself, wielding a hammer with the same focused competence she brought to everything else, because there was no one else to do it, and the work simply needed doing. Samuel Walker, when he had the strength, would sit in the cane chair on the porch and watch his daughter work and tell her she ought to go to town more, that she ought to find herself some young people to talk to, that she was wasting herself out here. Emma would look at him with eyes that were both gentle and immovable and tell him she was fine, that she wanted to be here, that there was nowhere else she would rather be. Most of the time she believed it. On the hardest days, when her back ached and her hands were cracked from cold water and her father had spent the night coughing so hard the whole small house shook, she believed it a little less. But she stayed. She always stayed. The town of Harlan's Creek had grown some in those 4 years. A new telegraph office had gone in. A second saloon had opened, which the women of the Methodist congregation viewed with collective disapproval. And in the spring of 1882, a cattle outfit from Texas came through driving a large herd north to the railroad at Dodge City, and they made their camp on the flat ground east of town for 3 days while they sorted the herd and rested the horses and let the men resupply. It was during those 3 days that Emma Walker first saw Timothy Archer. She had come into town on a Tuesday morning in early May with a basket of eggs and a short list of things she needed from Morrison's General Store. The town's main street was livelier than usual with the cowboys from the Texas outfit milling around, their horses tied at the rails, their voices carrying the particular easy confidence of men who spent their lives outdoors and considered the world a large and manageable place. Emma had learned to navigate men like that with a certain brisk efficiency, looking neither at them too directly nor away from them too deliberately, the way a woman learned to move through spaces that had been built without her comfort in mind. She was coming out of Morrison's with her basket replenished and a small sack of flour tucked under her arm when she stepped off the boardwalk and directly into the path of a horse. Not a running horse, not a panicked horse, but a large calm chestnut mare being led by its owner, who pulled up short and said, "Whoa there," with such immediate easy authority that the horse stopped at once, inches from Emma's shoulder. Emma stepped back, her flour pressed against her side, her basket swinging on her arm, and looked up. The man holding the horse's lead was tall, with the kind of sun-darkened skin that came from years of working outdoors under a sky that did not negotiate. He had dark brown hair that was a little too long under his hat brim and brown eyes that were, she noticed with some involuntary accuracy, very warm. He was perhaps 27 or 28, lean but broad through the shoulders, wearing the ordinary working clothes of a trail hand but wearing them with a kind of unassuming ease. He was looking at her with an expression that was not the lazy appraisal she sometimes got from trail hands in town, but something closer to genuine concern. "Are you all right, ma'am?" he said. "I'm sorry about that. Clara didn't see you." "I didn't see Clara either," Emma said, and her voice came out more dry than apologetic, which surprised her slightly. "We're both at fault." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile but the beginning of one. "That's fair," he said. "I'm Timothy Archer. I ride for the McAllen outfit out of Texas." "Emma Walker," she said. "I live outside of town." He nodded, looking at her with those warm brown eyes, and then he looked at the basket and the flour sack and the way she was managing all of it without appearing to need any help, and something in his expression shifted to something she could not immediately name. "That looks like a heavy load," he said. "Can I carry something to your wagon for you?" "I can manage," Emma said, which was true and which was also the thing she always said. "I know you can," Timothy Archer said, in a tone that suggested he found that entirely credible and also entirely beside the point. "But it would be my pleasure, if you'll allow it." She studied him for a moment. He was not being forward. He was not leering or pressing or performing the kind of exaggerated gallantry that some men used as a cover for something less pleasant. He was simply offering in the direct, uncomplicated way of a man who meant what he said. "All right," Emma said. He looped Clara's lead around the hitching post and took the flour sack from under her arm with no fanfare, and they walked together to where Emma's wagon was tied at the far end of the street. It was a short walk, not more than 2 minutes, but in those 2 minutes something happened that Emma could not have anticipated. He asked her a question. Not about herself, not the usual questions men asked women they had just met, not about whether she was married or whether her father was in town with her. He looked out at the flat edge of the prairie visible at the end of the street and said, "Do you like it here? In Kansas, I mean. Do you like the land?" Emma looked at him sideways. It was not the question she had expected. "I do," she said. "I always have. It's big. It makes me feel like I can breathe." "I feel the same about Texas," he said, "though Texas has more hills than this." "More trees. Is that where you're from originally?" "Sweetwater, Texas," he said, "though I haven't been back in 3 years. Trail drives don't lend themselves to staying in one place." "No," Emma said. "I expect not." They had reached the wagon, He set the flour sack in the bed with easy competence and held the basket while she climbed up to the seat, then handed it up to her. He stepped back and looked up at her with those warm eyes, and the morning sun was behind him, and the prairie wind was moving through the street in that soft, restless way it always did in May. "It was nice to meet you, Emma Walker," he said. "It was nice to meet you, Timothy Archer," she said, and she meant it, which surprised her. She drove home along the flat dirt road with the plains opening around her in every direction and the sky above as big and blue as a promise, and she thought about the question he had asked her. Not about whether she was all right, not about whether she needed anything, just whether she liked the land. As though she were a full person with opinions about the world, not just a woman in a difficult circumstance who needed to be managed or pitied or handled gently. It was a small thing. She knew it was a small thing, but small things, she had learned, were often the things that mattered. Her father was having a better day. He was sitting up in bed when she came in, and he ate a full bowl of the soup she had kept warm on the back of the stove, and he told her about a cattle drive he had done himself years ago, before Emma was born, when he had been young and the whole country had felt wide open. Emma sat with him until the afternoon light went golden and then slanted and then faded, and she listened to him talk, and she thought that this was what love looked like when you stripped away everything else. It looked like sitting in a quiet room and listening to someone you loved tell you the story of their life. She thought about Timothy Archer exactly once more that evening, when she was washing the supper dishes in the dark kitchen with the lamp burning low, and then she set the thought aside the way she set aside most things that were not immediately useful. But the next morning, she needed to go back to town. She had forgotten to get the carbolic soap that Dr. Phelps had told her to use when washing the cloths she used to clean her father's room, and without it, she could not be sure she was keeping things as clean as she needed to keep them. She hitched the wagon again and drove in before the heat of the day, and the Texas Outfits camp was still visible from the road, the smoke of their breakfast fires rising straight up in the still morning air. She came out of Morrison's to find Timothy Archer sitting on the bench outside the store, apparently doing nothing in particular, which she suspected was a thing trail hands rarely got to do, and perhaps appreciated all the more for that. He looked up when he heard the bell above the door and then stood, which was just good manners, but he did it without the stiff self-consciousness that suggested he was performing manners. He just stood. "Miss Walker," he said. "Mr. Archer," she said. "Are you just sitting?" "I am," he said. "We move out tomorrow. I figured I'd use the time well. And sitting outside a general store constitutes using the time well. Better than some of the alternatives available to a man in this town at this hour," he said, with a slight nod in the direction of the saloon down the street, where two men were already audibly arguing about something. Emma laughed. It came out of her before she thought about it, and it was a real laugh, not the polite social sound she sometimes produced in response to things that were mildly amusing. It was a real one, and it startled her slightly because she realized she could not remember the last time she had laughed like that. Timothy Archer looked at her when she laughed, and something in his expression settled, as though something that had been uncertain had become decided. "Could I trouble you for a few minutes of your time?" he said. "I could buy you a cup of coffee from the hotel dining room, if you've got time." Emma hesitated. The practical voice in her head said she should go home, that her father would need his midday medication, that there was always something that needed doing. But she had left her father sleeping comfortably, and Dr. Phelps had been out just 2 days ago and said Samuel was stable, and she had time. She simply was not accustomed to using time for herself. "All right," she said again. "A cup of coffee." They sat in the small dining room of the Harlan's Creek Hotel, which smelled of fried bacon and wood smoke and the particular slightly stale smell of rooms where a lot of different people had eaten over many years. The coffee was strong and bitter, the way Emma liked it, and they sat across from each other at a corner table and talked for an hour that felt like 20 minutes. He asked about the homestead, and she told him about it without self-pity or dramatization, the way she talked about most things. She told him about the garden and the chickens, and the fence line she had repaired herself last fall, and the winter that had been brutal enough to kill 2 of the 3 elm trees her mother had planted before Emma was born. She told him she had grown up here, that her mother had died when Emma was 12, that she and her father had managed together ever since, and that 4 years ago he had gotten sick and she had stayed to look after him. She told it plainly, as a sequence of facts. But she watched Timothy Archer's face as she told it, and she saw that he was hearing not just the facts but what was underneath the facts, the weight of it, the years of it, the way something enormous had been absorbed so thoroughly into daily life that she described it as though it were simply the ordinary shape of things. He was quiet for a moment when she finished. Then he said, "Who takes care of you?" The question landed in Emma's chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending rings out in every direction. She opened her mouth and closed it again. She looked at him across the table, at his serious, warm brown eyes, and she did not have an answer. Not because the question was complicated, but because it was so simple, and because she had genuinely never been asked it before. Not by Dr. Phelps, not by anyone in town, not by her father who loved her more than life itself, but who was too ill and too caught in his own struggle to look past it to hers. "I manage," she said, which was the true answer and also not an answer at all. "I know you do," Timothy said. "That wasn't what I asked." Emma set her coffee cup down. She looked at her hands on the table, the rough skin, the short practical nails, the small calluses at the base of her fingers from the hammer and the hoe and the bucket handles. She looked at them for a long moment. "No one," she said, "no one takes care of me." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that happens when something true has been said and both people know it and neither one wants to cover it over with noise. "I think that's wrong," Timothy said, quietly and without drama. "You deserve someone who does." Emma looked up at him. She felt something in her chest do something she had not felt in years, something warm and frightening and alive. "You leave tomorrow," she said. "I do," he said, "but the drive will be done in Dodge City in 6 weeks, maybe 8 if the water's low at the river crossings." He paused. "I could come back this way." "You could," Emma said carefully, "though I don't know why you would." "I think you do," Timothy said, and he looked at her with such directness and such honesty that Emma felt as though he had reached across the table and taken her hand, though he had not moved at all. She rode home that afternoon with the warm May sun on her back, and something she was almost afraid to name turning over slowly in her chest. Her father was awake and asking for water, and she gave it to him and sat with him while the afternoon went long and golden, and she held his hand, which felt thinner than it had a year ago, the bones more prominent, the skin like dry paper. She held his hand and thought about the question Timothy Archer had asked her, "Who takes care of you?" She thought about it for 6 weeks. The drive to Dodge City from Kansas pasture could take anywhere from 5 to 8 weeks depending on conditions, and Timothy had said 6 to 8 weeks. Emma told herself that she was not counting the days. She was aware of the days passing the way you are always aware of days when you are waiting for something, even when you are pretending you are not waiting. Her father had a bad spell in the middle of those 6 weeks, one of the worst he had had in some months. 3 nights in a row, he coughed so hard through the darkness that Emma barely slept, sitting up in the chair beside his bed with a damp cloth to wipe his face and her hand on his back during the worst of the spasms, speaking quietly to him the way she had once heard him speak to a frightened horse, low and steady, and without urgency. On the 4th day he was so weak he could not sit up, and Emma sent word into town for Dr. Phelps, who came out that afternoon on his old gray mare. Dr. Phelps listened to Samuel's chest for a long time and said that the disease had progressed, as he had known it would, as tuberculosis always did in the end. He told Emma that her father might have several months yet, or he might have fewer. He told her that she was doing everything right and that there was nothing more that medicine could offer. He told her to make sure Samuel ate as much as he could manage and to keep the room as clean and aired as the weather allowed. And he told her, looking at her over the rims of his spectacles with the eyes of a man who had delivered difficult news enough times to know how it landed, that she ought to prepare herself. Emma thanked him. She walked him to his horse. She stood in the yard and watched him ride back toward town, and then she sat down on the porch steps and put her face in her hands and cried. Not the quiet, careful crying she did at night so as not to disturb her father. She cried the way she had not permitted herself to cry in years, deeply and fully, with her whole body, until there was nothing left, and she was simply sitting on the steps in the early evening light feeling emptied out and strangely lighter for it. Then she got up and went inside and made supper. That was what you did. You cried when you needed to, and then you got up and you went on, because the going on was not optional, and the crying, however necessary, was only ever a parenthesis in the work of living. Her father recovered somewhat over the following 2 weeks. Not to where he had been before the bad spell, but enough that he could sit up again, enough that he could eat some solid food and talk for short periods without exhausting himself entirely. On one of those evenings he said to Emma, who was mending a shirt by the lamp, "You are too young to have an old man's life." Emma looked up from the mending. "It's my life," she said. "I chose it." "I know you did," Samuel said. "I worry about after." He looked at her with eyes that had the particular clarity of people who are very sick and have had a long time to sit with things that are hard. "After I'm gone," he said simply. "I worry about you being alone." "Father," Emma said. "I'm not being morbid," he said. "I'm being a father. There's a difference." He paused and coughed a little, the small, careful kind. Is there anyone in your life I should know about?" Emma thought of Timothy Archer and his warm brown eyes and the question he had asked her over bad hotel coffee in a dusty dining room. She thought of him saying, "I could come back this way." "There might be someone," she said. "It's very early. I don't know yet." Samuel looked at her for a long moment. "Tell me about him." So she did. She told her father about the almost collision with the chestnut mare named Clara, about the flour sack carried to the wagon, about the coffee, about the question that had hollowed her out and filled her back up in the same moment. She told it to her father the way she had told Timothy about the homestead, plainly and without embellishment, and her father listened with his thin hands folded on the blanket and his eyes bright. "He sounds like a man who pays attention," Samuel said when she was done. "He does," Emma agreed. "Those are the best kind," Samuel said. "Your mother was like that. She noticed things." "I remember," Emma said, and she did. She remembered her mother noticing the particular quality of light before a storm, noticing when a neighbor was struggling before they said anything, noticing when Emma was sad and sitting with her without immediately trying to fix it. Emma had tried, for 12 years and then for 26 years, to be the kind of person her mother had been. She was not sure she had succeeded, but she had tried. "If he comes back," Samuel said, "I'd like to meet him." "If he comes back," Emma said, "I will make sure of it." He came back on a Wednesday in the second week of July, appearing out of the afternoon heat haze on the road that came in from the north, riding a different horse than before, a deep bay gelding that moved with the particular smooth economy of a well-trained animal. Emma was in the garden when she saw the dust of him coming, and she told herself that her heart had not lurched in her chest. She told herself this calmly, and without any particular conviction. She met him at the gate with dirt on her hands, and her hair coming loose from its pins, wearing her work dress that had a mended tear on the left sleeve. She had no warning and no time to present herself differently than she was, which was perhaps the best thing that could have happened, because it meant the conversation that followed was between the real Emma Walker and the real Timothy Archer with no performance between them. He looked exactly as she had remembered him, which she had not entirely trusted her memory to produce accurately. He dismounted at the gate and took off his hat and said, "I told you I might come back." "You did," Emma said. "I half expected you not to." "I keep my word," he said, and it was not said as a boast but as a statement of plain fact, the way you might say the sky is blue or water runs downhill. "Come in," Emma said. My father is resting, but he's awake. He wants to meet you." Something in Timothy's face registered what that meant, the significance of it, and he nodded without making a fuss of it, which was, Emma was beginning to understand, characteristic of him. Samuel Walker was sitting up in bed with his reading glasses on and a worn Bible in his lap, though Emma suspected he had arranged himself in this position when he heard the gate and had not actually been reading. He looked at Timothy Archer with the focused, measuring attention of a man who had spent a lifetime reading horses and weather and other men, and had gotten quite good at it. Timothy stood at the foot of the bed and did not fidget or look around the room or do any of the things men sometimes did when they were uncomfortable. He looked at Samuel steadily and said, "Mr. Walker, I'm Timothy Archer. I'm glad to meet you, sir." "Sit down," Samuel said, gesturing at the chair beside the bed. Emma brought the chair from the corner and Timothy sat in it, and Emma stood in the doorway and watched her father talk to this man she had been thinking about for 6 weeks, and she felt something she recognized with some delay as hope. Samuel asked Timothy where he was from and what his trade was, and whether he had family. Timothy answered each question directly. He was from Sweetwater, Texas. He had been a cowhand since he was 17, working his way up to trail boss on the McAllen outfit, which he had been doing for the past 3 years. His parents had died in a fever outbreak when he was 19, his mother first and his father 3 days later. He had a younger sister named Rose who had married a farmer in central Texas and had 2 small children. He went to see her when the drives allowed, which was not as often as he would like. "Do you intend to be a cowhand all your life?" Samuel asked. "No, sir," Timothy said. "I intend to have land of my own one day. I've been saving for it. I have enough set by now that it's not just a notion anymore." He paused. "I'd like to put down roots somewhere." Samuel looked at him for a moment longer, and then he looked at Emma in the doorway, and Emma saw in her father's face the particular expression of a man who has been worried about something for a long time and has just unexpectedly stopped worrying about it. "Good," Samuel said. He leaned back against his pillow. "My daughter makes very good coffee. You ought to stay for supper." Timothy stayed for supper, and then he stayed in Harlan's Creek. Not on the homestead, which would not have been appropriate, but at the boarding house in town, run by a widow named Mrs. Forrester, who kept a clean establishment and charged reasonable rates, and did not ask unnecessary questions of her boarders. He had separated from the McAllen outfit at Dodge City, having earned his wages for the drive, and he had come back to Harlan's Creek with no fixed obligation pulling him anywhere else. He came out to the homestead every day, not always for long, and always in the full light of day, and always without expectation. He would help Emma with whatever needed doing, not in the manner of a man who is humoring a woman who should not be doing such things, but in the manner of a working partner, simply identifying what needed doing and doing it with her. He mended the east fence, which had 3 posts that had been leaning since last winter. He fixed the hinge on the barn door. He hauled water with her in the mornings, handling the heavy buckets with easy strength that he applied without comment, and she found that working alongside him felt different from working alone in a way she could not precisely define, except that it felt lighter somehow, not the work itself but the weight of it. He was also, she discovered, someone her father genuinely enjoyed. On the evenings when Samuel had sufficient strength and sufficient mood, Timothy would sit with him after supper and they would talk, and Emma would wash the dishes and listen to the sound of their voices through the thin wall and think that she had not heard her father laugh in a long time, really laugh, and that she was hearing it now. There was one evening in late July when the heat had finally broken, and a cool wind was coming in off the plains, and Emma and Timothy were sitting on the porch after supper, her father already asleep inside. The fireflies were doing their slow, silent signaling in the grass at the edge of the yard, and the stars above the Kansas plain were so dense and bright they seemed close enough to touch. "Can I ask you something?" Emma said. "Anything," Timothy said, which was also characteristic of him. She was learning. He did not hedge. "Why did you come back, truly? You've been here 3 weeks. You're not working. You're spending your savings staying at Mrs. Forrester's. You could be doing another drive, earning money toward that land you want." Timothy was quiet for a moment, looking out at the fireflies. "I came back because I could not think of any good reason not to," he said. "Which is not the same as not thinking about it. I thought about it a good deal. I asked myself whether it made sense, practically speaking, to come back to a small town in Kansas where I knew one person who was a woman I had spoken to for an hour over bad coffee." He paused, and I kept coming back to the same answer. "What answer?" "That I hadn't felt that way in a long time, like I wanted to stay somewhere, like a specific place was pulling at me rather than just the road in front of me." He looked at her. "You pull at me, Emma. This sounds like a foolish thing to say to a woman I've only known for a few weeks." "It doesn't sound foolish," Emma said quietly. "I also think," he said more slowly, as though he was being careful with the words, "that you have been giving everything you have to other things and other people for a very long time, and that I would like to be the person who gives some of it back, if you'll allow that." Emma looked at him in the dark, at the planes of his face in the faint light from the window behind them and the glow of the night sky above. She thought about the 4 years of early mornings and cold water and quiet worry and no one to say good morning to, and no one to say good night to, and no one to ask how she was. Not really, not in the way that needed an honest answer. She said, "I am not an easy situation. My father is very ill. I cannot promise what the next months will look like or what I will be able to offer in terms of time or attention." "I know that," Timothy said. "I'm not asking for time or attention. I'm asking to be here, that's all." She reached over in the dark and took his hand, which was lying on the arm of his chair, and she held it. His hand was large and warm and work-roughened, the same as hers, and he turned it and held hers back without making any more of it than it was, which was everything. They sat like that for a long time without talking, listening to the fireflies' silent light show and the distant sound of a coyote on the plain and the slow breathing of the sleeping man inside, and Emma thought that this was what peace felt like. She had almost forgotten. In August, Timothy bought a horse for the homestead. Not a grand gesture, not announced as a gift but offered practically. Emma's old draft horse had developed a leg problem and could no longer be relied upon for the wagon, and he had found a steady bay mare at the livery who was well-trained and sound and reasonably priced. He asked Emma to come and look at her before he bought anything, because it was Emma's horse and Emma's decision, and Emma looked at the mare with her careful practical eye and said she was a good horse and yes. He also started spending more of his time being useful in ways that went beyond the homestead. He talked to some of the other homesteaders in the area and offered his labor on their properties in exchange for supplies or cash, which helped him stretch his savings and gave him something to do with his hands and his days, which were built for work. People in Harlan's Creek started to know who he was, the cowboy staying at Mrs. Forrester's who was courting Emma Walker, and they approved of him in the measured way that frontier communities approved of people who were willing to work and who did not cause trouble. The one exception was a man named Gerald Hooper, who ran the largest cattle operation near Harlan's Creek and who had, some years back, made it clear to Emma that he would have been interested in purchasing the Walker homestead if Samuel ever came to need the money. Emma had told him with polite and absolute firmness that the homestead was not for sale, and Gerald Hooper had not liked it but had accepted it. He was not a bad man exactly, but he was the kind of man who believed that owning a great deal of land made him the most important person in any given room, and he had a way of looking at women and at men who did not own much land with the same expression, slightly condescending, slightly impatient. He came out to the homestead one afternoon in August when Timothy happened to be there repairing the well cover, and he sat on his horse at the gate and called out to Emma, who came from the garden. "I heard you've got a boarder of sorts," Hooper said, looking at Timothy with that flat, assessing gaze. "I have a friend who helps out," Emma said. Hooper looked at Timothy again. Timothy had stopped working and was watching the exchange with quiet attention, neither aggressive nor deferential. "I'll renew my offer on the property," Hooper said to Emma. "Given your father's situation, it would be a fair price. You could take a room in town, somewhere comfortable." "Thank you for the offer," Emma said, in a tone that conveyed the opposite of gratitude. "The homestead is not for sale, Mr. Hooper, and that has not changed." "Your father will not be with you much longer," Hooper said, not unkindly but with a bluntness that was its own kind of unkindness. "And a woman alone out here on this much land. She won't be alone," Timothy said. He had walked to the fence and was leaning on the post nearest the gate, looking at Hooper with a pleasant expression that contained something underneath it that was not entirely pleasant. "I intend to stay." Hooper looked at him. "And who are you, exactly?" "Timothy Archer," Timothy said. "I expect you'll be seeing me around." There was a pause in which Gerald Hooper recalibrated whatever he had expected to find here, and then rearranged his expression into something more civil. He tipped his hat to Emma and rode back the way he had come, and Emma turned and looked at Timothy at the fence and said, "You didn't have to do that." "I know," Timothy said, but it was true. He met her eyes. "If you'll have me." It was not a formal proposal, not yet, but it was the shape of one, the intention of one, and Emma understood it exactly for what it was. "Ask me properly," she said. "When you're ready." He smiled then, the full version of the almost smile she had first seen outside Morrison's general store, and it changed his face completely into something that made her chest hurt in the very best way. September came in with its early mornings and the first cool breath of autumn beginning to thread through the air, and Samuel Walker declined again, this time more sharply and more finally. Dr. Phelps came out again, and on his third visit in as many weeks he drew Emma aside in the yard and told her that he thought it would be weeks now, not months. He told her she was doing everything right and that her father was not in pain, and that the kindest thing she was doing was being present, that being present was sometimes the entirety of what medicine could offer, and that she was providing it. Emma asked Dr. Phelps whether her father knew. Phelps said that Samuel Walker had known for a very long time, and had made his peace with it in the way that strong people sometimes did, not happily, not without grief, but with a kind of dignified acceptance that came from having lived a full life and loved the people in it well. Timothy had moved his things from Mrs. Forrester's boarding house to a small barn on a neighboring property whose owner, an older farmer named Carver, had agreed to let him use it in exchange for help with the fall harvest. He was near enough to the Walker homestead to be there quickly if Emma needed him, and she knew he was there, and the knowing of it was a comfort she had not expected to feel so deeply. On a Thursday evening in late September, Samuel Walker asked Emma to bring him the small tin box he kept under the bed. Emma brought it out and he opened it and took out a folded piece of paper and a woman's ring, a simple gold band with a small dark red stone that Emma recognized as her mother's. He put the paper and the ring in Emma's hand and closed her fingers around them. "The paper is the deed to the property," he said. "Fully yours. There are no debts on it. I made sure of that." He looked at her with eyes that were tired but entirely clear. "And the ring was your mother's. She wanted you to have it." Emma could not speak. She held the ring and the deed in her closed hands and looked at her father. "Your young man," Samuel said. "He's a good one. Your mother would have liked him." "I know," Emma managed. "Don't wait too long to be happy," Samuel said. "That's the only thing I'll tell you. The rest you know for yourself." He settled back into his pillow. "I'm tired, sweetheart. I think I'll sleep." "Sleep," Emma said. She kissed his forehead, the way he had kissed hers when she was very small, and tucked the blanket more closely around him, and sat in the chair beside his bed and held his hand until his breathing slowed and deepened. Samuel Walker died in the early hours of a Friday morning in the first week of October 1882, quietly and without distress, his hand in his daughter's. The sunrise that came after was one of the most beautiful Emma had ever seen, all gold and rose over the flat edge of the world, the sky enormous and clear. She sat with him for a while longer in the quiet, And then she got up and went to the porch and looked out at the morning. And she thought about all the mornings she had sat with him, and all the evenings and all the long nights. And she thought that grief was a strange thing because it was present and past at once. You mourned both the person who was gone and all the ordinary days that were gone with them. She heard hoofbeats on the road and knew them for Timothy's horse without looking. He came up the lane and took one look at her face, and dismounted and came to where she stood on the porch and put his arms around her. And she put her face against his chest and held on. She did not say anything. He did not say anything. He held her in the morning quiet while the sun came up and the chickens stirred in their coop and the new bay mare moved in the corral, and after a while the grief in Emma's chest found room to sit alongside everything else, and she took a deep breath and straightened. "I'll need to go to town," she said. "I need to let Dr. Phelps know." "I'll go," Timothy said. "You stay here, I'll bring him back." She nodded. He went. She went inside and sat with her father and waited. And the morning light moved across the floor of the room the way it always had, exactly the way it had on every other morning of her life in that house. The next weeks were the practical aftermath of loss, which has its own kind of mercy in that it keeps you moving and occupied, so that the grief cannot consume you all at once, but must settle in slowly, in between the arrangements and the paperwork and the neighbors who came to pay their respects, and the letters that needed writing. The community of Harlan's Creek, for all its smallness and its imperfections, was generous in the way frontier communities often were, understanding deeply that everyone was vulnerable out here, and that today's neighbor in need would be next season's neighbor with a full harvest willing to share it. Mrs. Morrison from the general store came with food. Old Carver came and sat with Emma for an afternoon, and talked about Samuel the way people who knew the same person talked together, trading memories back and forth like cards, building something whole from individual pieces. Even Gerald Hooper came to pay his respects, and he did it with surprising decency, hat in hand, saying that Samuel Walker had been a good neighbor and that he was sorry for the loss. Timothy was there through all of it, managing the things that needed managing without taking over, present without being overwhelming, giving Emma exactly the amount of space and the amount of closeness that she needed, and somehow knowing the difference at every moment. On a Sunday afternoon in mid-October, when the plains were the color of old copper and the cottonwoods along the creek had gone yellow, Timothy asked Emma to walk with him. They walked out across the homestead, past the garden and the corral and through the gate in the east fence and out onto the open grassland, where the horizon was so far away it seemed like a rumor. He stopped in the middle of the field with the sky enormous above them, and he turned to face her, and he took off his hat, and he was the most earnest and unguarded she had ever seen him, which was saying something because he was always more open than most men she had known. "Emma," he said, "I know the timing is not ideal. Your father just passed and you are grieving, and I don't want to seem like I'm rushing past that because I'm not. We can wait as long as you need, but I want you to know what I'm asking so that it's not a question in either of our minds." Emma waited. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you since that morning with the bad coffee and your dirt-roughened hands on the table. I want to stay here. I want to work this land with you and build something here together. I want to be the answer to that question I asked you, the one about who takes care of you, because the answer should be me, and you should be the answer for me too. That's how I think it's supposed to work." He reached into his coat pocket and brought out the small box he had made by the jeweler in Dodge City on the last drive, and he opened it, and inside was a ring, simple gold with a small inset stone the color of a summer sky, chosen, she would later learn, because he had been thinking of the Kansas sky when he looked at the case of stones in the jeweler's shop. "Will you marry me?" he said. Emma looked at him in the October light with the grass moving around them in the wind and the whole wide prairie as witness, and she thought about 4 years of being alone, and the morning he had almost knocked her down with a horse and the question that had changed something in her permanently, and she thought about her father's hands folded on the blanket and her mother's ring in the tin box and the way love looked when you stripped everything else away. "Yes," she said, "I will." He put the ring on her finger, and then he put his arms around her, and she put her arms around him, and they stood in the middle of the Kansas grassland in the autumn sun. And Emma thought that the world had never looked more beautiful and more kind, which was not what she had thought on that morning 4 years ago, and that the difference between those 2 mornings was the distance she had traveled, and that it had been worth every single difficult step. They were married in November, in the small Methodist church in Harlan's Creek, by the Reverend Harold Cotton, who had a beard like a prophet and a voice that carried well, and who was clearly pleased to be conducting a ceremony that the whole community seemed to regard as a thoroughly appropriate outcome to a story they had all been watching develop. Mrs. Forrester decorated the church with dried wildflowers, and the congregation turned out in full, including old Carver, who cried openly and without embarrassment, and Mrs. Morrison, who baked a wedding cake that was genuinely remarkable, 3 layers with sugar frosting in a time and place where such things represented a significant expenditure of effort and resources, and were therefore a measure of real love. Emma wore her mother's ring on her right hand during the ceremony, and the ring Timothy had given her on her left, and she wore a dress that had been her mother's, altered by Mrs. Morrison's daughter, who had quick fingers and a good eye, pale blue wool that was exactly the color of the stone in her ring, though she had not known that when she chose it. Timothy stood at the front of the church in his best clothes, which were clean and pressed, and which he wore with the same unself-conscious ease with which he wore everything. And when Emma came down the aisle on the arm of old Carver, who had offered himself for the purpose, Timothy looked at her with an expression on his face that Emma would remember for the rest of her life. It was not the polished expression of a man at his own wedding performing the role of groom. It was the face of a man who could not quite believe his own good fortune and was not trying to conceal it, wonder and love and gratitude all at once, entirely unguarded. She had to look away for a moment because if she did not she would cry before she even reached the altar, and she had decided she would not cry in the church. She cried afterward, at the small celebration at the homestead, a little, when she was briefly alone in the kitchen for a moment, and she looked at the room and thought of her father sitting at the table in the evenings with his hands folded and his patient eyes, and she cried for him, and for her mother, and for all the versions of herself that had gotten her to this moment. Then she wiped her face and went back out to her husband and her neighbors and her new life. That winter was cold even by Kansas standards, with deep snow in December that drifted against the barn and the fences, and had to be cleared each morning before the animals could be tended. Emma and Timothy worked it together, as they worked everything together, developing without discussion the particular choreography of 2 people who know each other well enough that they do not need to negotiate the small daily logistics, because they have already been sorted into a pattern that fits both of them. Timothy had written to his sister Rose in Texas shortly after Samuel's death, telling her about Emma and about his intention to stay in Kansas. Rose had written back a letter that was warm and practical, and that contained, Emma suspected reading between the lines, a significant degree of relief that her wandering older brother had found himself an anchor. Rose had also sent a gift for the wedding, a hand-quilted blanket in the pattern called wedding ring, made with fabric in blues and golds, which arrived slightly late due to the distances involved but was none the less welcome for that. In the spring of 1883, Timothy made the purchase he had been saving toward for years. Not entirely new land, because new land cost more than he had, but the homestead they were already on. He sat down with Emma and her father's papers and a serious expression, and worked out with her what it would mean to put his savings into improving the property, sinking a proper new well, expanding the barn, and acquiring 2 more horses and a small herd of cattle. Emma contributed her practical knowledge of the land and what it needed, which was considerable, And they made the plans together at the kitchen table with paper and pencil and cups of the good coffee Emma made, which Timothy maintained was the best coffee in western Kansas. An assessment she suspected was partially love, but also at least partially accurate. Gerald Hooper had come around again in the spring, not about buying the property this time, but to offer Timothy some work with his outfit during calving season, which Timothy accepted, because the income was useful, and because one of the practical realities of building something from the ground up was that you took work where it was available while you were establishing yourself. Hooper had come to understand that the Walker homestead was not available for purchase and seemed, somewhat to Emma's surprise, to have accepted that with reasonable grace. He was not a man she would ever consider a friend, but he was not an enemy either, and the frontier was not a place where you could afford unnecessary enemies. By summer of 1883 the homestead had changed. The new well was in, deep and clean and producing good water reliably. The barn had been expanded. The garden was larger than Emma had ever managed to maintain it alone, because she now had a partner to share the work of it. They had 6 cattle and a small additional pasture fenced in, and Timothy was talking with some of the other men in the area about a cooperative arrangement for branding and driving, which would make the economics of small-scale cattle ranching more viable for everyone. There was a difficulty that spring that Emma had not anticipated. One of the neighboring homesteaders, a man named Dillard, was in financial trouble and had taken to encroaching on other people's water access, diverting a small creek that ran through several properties to favor his own land. The arrangement was not legal and everyone knew it, but confronting Dillard directly had done nothing because he was both desperate and stubborn, a difficult combination. Emma went to the town council about it, which was the proper channel, and she was received with the polite superficial attention that women's concerns sometimes received from all male councils in that era, acknowledged in form but not fully in substance. She was not surprised exactly, but she was frustrated, and she said as much to Timothy that evening, not asking him to fix it but simply giving voice to the frustration. Timothy thought about it for a day and then went to see old Carver and 2 other neighboring landowners, and the 4 of them went together to see the town council, and they laid out the same facts Emma had laid out but as a collective group of male property owners, which the council found more actionable. Emma understood the injustice of that difference clearly enough to be angry about it in a general way, and she told Timothy so, and he agreed without qualification that it was unjust, which she appreciated more than a reassurance that it would all be fine. The water issue was resolved through a council order that reinstated the original water access arrangement and gave Dillard a formal warning. It was not a perfect resolution because Dillard remained resentful, but it held, and after a season he moved his family further west to try their luck elsewhere. On a warm evening in July of 1883, Emma told Timothy she was pregnant. She told him in the kitchen after supper, in the ordinary light of the lamp, which seemed to her the right place for important things, at the kitchen table where she had sat with her father and where she now sat with her husband. She told him simply, directly, in the way she told everything. Timothy went very still for a moment, the way he did when something landed large. Then he stood up from his chair and came around the table and knelt down beside hers, which was not a theatrical gesture but just the instinct to be at her level, to be close, and he took her hands in both of his and looked at her face. "Are you well?" he asked first, which was the right question. "I'm well," she said. "Everything seems right. I'll have Dr. Phelps come out." He held her hands and said, "This is the best thing you have ever told me. Better than yes when you asked me to marry you." He considered this with genuine seriousness. "Equal to it," he decided. "Both together are the best things I have ever been told." Dr. Phelps came out that week and confirmed everything and told Emma that she was in good health, and that the pregnancy appeared to be progressing normally, and that she ought to continue doing essentially what she was doing, but take care not to overextend herself, and to rest when she needed rest. Emma received this advice with the same expression she gave to most advice about not overextending herself, which was polite acknowledgement combined with a private assessment of what she actually intended to do. Timothy, however, turned out to be a surprisingly effective advocate for Emma resting, not by insisting or lecturing, but by simply taking on more of the work himself, and occasionally appearing at her elbow with a glass of water or a chair placed in a strategically convenient location, which she found both slightly amusing and deeply touching. The autumn of 1883 was the most golden autumn Emma could remember. The wheat harvest was good, the cattle were healthy, the prairie was all amber and copper in the October light, and Emma was 7 months pregnant and felt, for all the physical discomfort of that particular state, something she could only describe as deeply, rootedly alive. She wrote to Rose in Texas, and Rose wrote back immediately. Her letter full of practical wisdom about pregnancy and new motherhood and what to expect, all of it useful and warm, and delivered with the frank affection of someone who had decided to love her brother's wife on trust, and found the trust well placed. Their son was born on a Monday morning in December, in the bedroom of the homestead, with Dr. Phelps in attendance and Mrs. Morrison's daughter as midwife, because she had helped bring half the babies in Harlan's Creek into the world and was good at it. The labor was long but straightforward, which Emma understood in retrospect to have been a considerable mercy. Their son arrived with the insistent vocalism of a healthy child who has an opinion about the temperature differential between where he has been and where he now finds himself. Timothy, who had been in the adjacent room being comprehensively useless in the way that fathers are in such moments, was brought in when it was over. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son in Emma's arms and looked at Emma with those warm brown eyes, and he did not say anything for a long moment because there was nothing to say that was large enough. "Hello," Emma said to the baby, who was wrinkled and red and perfect. "Hello," Timothy said, in a voice that was not entirely steady. They named him Samuel, for Emma's father, with William as a middle name for no reason except that they both liked it. Samuel William Archer arrived in the world in December 1883 and proceeded immediately to reorganize the homestead around his needs and preferences, which it turned out were various and vigorously expressed. Rose came from Texas to visit in the spring of 1884, bringing her husband James and their 2 small children, a visit that required some creative sleeping arrangement management in the homestead, but that Emma organized with the efficiency she brought to everything. Rose was a compact, energetic woman with her brother's warm brown eyes and the same quality he had of paying close attention to things, and she and Emma liked each other immediately and genuinely, which neither of them had been entirely certain would happen but both of them had hoped for. Rose held baby Samuel and declared him perfect, and then looked at Emma over the baby's head with frank appraisal and said, "You are exactly what I hoped you would be. He wrote about you so much. I was worried I had built it up." "You hadn't," Emma said, which surprised her with its own certainty. "No," Rose agreed, "I hadn't." On the last evening of Rose's visit they all sat on the porch after supper, the adults with coffee, the children already asleep inside, and the stars were out in their full Kansas density, and Timothy and James talked about farming and cattle, and Rose and Emma talked about everything else, and Samuel made small contented sounds from the basket at Emma's feet, and the warm light from the window fell out across the porch boards. And Emma looked at her husband across the circle of conversation and caught him looking at her at the same moment, and the look that passed between them in that instant contained everything. Life on the homestead in the years that followed had the quality of something that has been chosen so deliberately and built so carefully that it feels both earned and miraculous. There were hard seasons. There was a drought year in 1885 that made everyone in the county hold their breath and count their reserves. There was a winter illness that swept through Harlan's Creek and kept Emma nursing her son back to health through a terrifying week, during which Timothy slept in the chair beside Samuel's bed, and Emma slept in the other chair, and they traded off the watching through the nights. Samuel recovered, as young children with fierce constitutions and attentive parents often do, and came out of it a little thinner and entirely unimpressed by the drama he had apparently caused. Timothy expanded the cattle operation steadily, and by 1886 the homestead was a genuine small ranch, not large by the standards of men like Gerald Hooper, but solid and sound and productive in theirs. He hired 2 hands to help with the cattle work, young men both, one named Pete who was 17 and new to the territory, learning the trade from scratch, and one named Davis who was 21 and capable and quiet. Timothy was a fair employer, which people noticed in the way that fairness is noticed when it is not universal, and the men who worked for him were loyal in the way that people become loyal when they are treated with consistent respect. Emma ran the household and the garden and the chickens and kept the books for the ranch operation, because she had a good head for numbers, and Timothy freely admitted that his own head for numbers was adequate but not exceptional, which was one of the things she loved about him, his complete comfort with what he was good at and what he was not, and his complete absence of wounded pride about the latter. In the autumn of 1886, their daughter was born. They named her Clara, for the chestnut mare who had been the occasion of their first meeting, which Dr. Phelps said was the most romantic horse-related thing he had ever encountered, and which Timothy received with great satisfaction, and Emma received with great amusement. Clara arrived with her brother's vocalism and her mother's gray eyes, and Timothy maintained from the very beginning an expression of focused assessment that was entirely her mother's, as though she had arrived ready to evaluate everything and had already formed some preliminary opinions. Samuel, who was 2 years and 9 months old and deeply suspicious of this new development for approximately 3 days, was entirely won over when Clara closed her tiny hand around his finger and he looked up at Timothy with an expression of complete astonishment and said, "She is very strong, Papa." "She is," Timothy agreed. "She gets that from her mother." The winter of 1886 and into 1887 was when things came fully together in the way that things sometimes do, not in a single dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of ordinary days that you recognize in retrospect as having been extraordinary. Emma would look back on that winter as the season in which the life she had built with Timothy stopped feeling like something new and started feeling like something deep and permanent, like something that had always been true and had simply been waiting to be discovered. They had a routine that was theirs alone, shaped by the particular natures of 2 people who had been largely solitary for long enough that they were deliberate about how they chose to share their space. Mornings Timothy was up first, because the cattle were his first responsibility, and he would have the stove going and the coffee started by the time Emma came out with the baby, or, once Clara was old enough, with a child on each side of her. They had their coffee together before the day fully swallowed them, 20 minutes most mornings, sitting at the kitchen table in the early light, talking or not talking in the easy way of people who are comfortable with both. Evenings, when the work was done and the children were in bed, they would sit by the fire and Emma would read or mend, and Timothy would sometimes work on the accounts or sometimes just sit, which she had never seen him do when she first met him, and which she now understood to be something he did only when he was very comfortable, the particular stillness of a man who is where he wants to be and knows it. On one such evening in January 1887, with the wind driving snow against the windows and the fire burning well and the children asleep, Timothy said without preamble, "Are you happy?" Emma looked up from her book. He was watching the fire with his long legs stretched toward the warmth, his coffee cup on the arm of the chair, his face in the firelight showing every line that weather and work and years had put there, which she found beautiful in the specific way that faces become beautiful when you know them very well. "Yes," she said, "I am. Are you?" "More than I deserve," he said. "You deserve it," Emma said, with the firmness she used for things she was sure of. He looked at her across the fire-lit room and smiled, the full smile, and she felt her chest do the thing it had always done when he smiled at her. The same warm, lurching thing it had done in the hotel dining room all those years ago, undimmed by familiarity, untouched by time. "Come here," he said. She got up from her chair and came to his and sat beside him in the warmth, and he put his arm around her and she put her head against his shoulder, and they sat in the firelight while the snow came down outside and the children slept safely behind the wall and the horses were warm in the barn and the cattle were settled in the pasture and the whole of their life was around them in every direction. "Timothy," she said. That question you asked me the first time we talked. Do you remember?" "Who takes care of you," he said. He remembered it. She knew he remembered it. "I have an answer now," she said. He pressed his lips to the top of her head. "So do I," he said. The spring of 1887 brought warm, early rains that were very good for the wheat and moderately complicated for the cattle, who discovered that new spring mud was an interesting medium to stand in until it became deeply inconvenient. Pete, the young hand, had developed considerably under Timothy's direction and was talking about setting up his own operation. Davis had taken a wife from town, a Cheyenne woman named Maggie whose family had been in the territory before any of the settlers arrived, a fact that the town of Harlan's Creek received with varying degrees of discomfort that Emma had very little patience for, and said so, clearly, to the people who felt the need to express their discomfort to her. Maggie was a capable and kind person, and Emma was glad to know her, and that was the end of Emma's interest in other people's opinions on the matter. Rose and James visited again in the summer of 1887, and this time there was more room because Timothy had added 2 rooms to the east side of the house the previous fall, properly done with good lumber from the mill at Dodge, with real windows and wood floors, so that the homestead had become a house of some substance, not grand but solid and well-made. Rose walked through the new rooms and said, with great satisfaction, "This is a proper house." "It is," Timothy agreed and looked at Emma, and Emma looked back at him, and the look contained the whole history of the place, her mother's elm trees and her father in the cane chair on the porch, and the morning she had stood in the yard watching Robert Caldwell ride away, and the morning she had stood at the kitchen window watching the sun rise and thinking the world looked beautiful and cruel, and all the mornings since. In the autumn of 1887, Dr. Phelps came out to examine Emma because she had asked him to come, and he confirmed what she had suspected for 6 weeks. She was pregnant again. She told Timothy at the kitchen table with the lamp burning between them, and he stood up from his chair exactly the way he had done the first time, and came around the table and knelt beside hers and took her hands. "Are you well?" he said first, which was still the right question, and it was still the question she loved him for asking first. "I'm very well," she said. "Good," he said, and held her hands and looked at her face for a long moment, and then he said, "I used to ride all over the country and never feel like I was anywhere. Do you know what I mean?" "Tell me," she said. "I mean that before I came to Kansas, before I found you, I was just moving. And you can live like that on the surface of things and it's not nothing. But it's not this." He squeezed her hands. "This is having a home." Emma looked at this man, her husband, this cowboy who had almost knocked her down with a horse, and then asked her if she liked the land, and then asked her who took care of her, and then asked her to marry him in a field of autumn grass with the whole sky as witness. She looked at him kneeling beside her chair in the lamplight of the kitchen her father had built, in the house they had made into their home, and she thought that the world had offered her, after every difficult thing it had put in her way, something very fine indeed. "You are my home too," she said. "You know that." He got up from the floor and pulled her up with him and held her in the kitchen with the lamp burning and the night outside coming on dark and wide over the plains, and she put her arms around his neck and held on, and it felt like it had on the porch steps the morning after her father died, like being held together from the outside, except that now it was mutual and permanent and chosen. Their third child, another son, was born in the spring of 1888, during a tremendous rainstorm that lasted 3 days and filled every creek in the county to its banks. They named him James, for Rose's husband, which Rose received with the kind of emotion that she covered quickly with practicality in the way she covered most things. James Walker Archer came into the world noisily, like his brother and sister before him, and joined the household with the immediate confidence of someone who belongs exactly where they are. Samuel, who was 4 and had come through his initial suspicion of Clara to become her devoted, if sometimes overbearing companion, viewed the new baby with the equanimity of someone who had already done this once and knew how it went. He told Clara very seriously that they had to be gentle with the baby because he was small, and Clara, who was a year and a half and had been told this herself not so long ago, agreed with great authority. The summer of 1888 brought a letter from Pete, the young hand who had moved on and started his own small operation 2 counties east. He wrote to say that he had done well enough in his first season that he was now able to offer a wage to a hand of his own, and that he wanted Timothy to know it, and that he wanted to thank him for what he had learned under his direction. Timothy read the letter at the breakfast table and passed it to Emma without comment, but his expression was the one he wore when he was quietly and thoroughly pleased about something, and Emma read the letter and smiled and handed it back. "You did well by him," she said. "He did the work," Timothy said. "You taught him what the work was," Emma said. "That's not nothing." He folded the letter and put it in his pocket and picked up his coffee and looked at her over the rim of the cup. "Did I tell you this morning that I love you?" "Not yet," Emma said. "I love you," he said. "I know," she said. "I love you too." It was a Tuesday morning in August, and the children were making noise in the other room, and the stove was warm, and the coffee was good, and outside the window the Kansas plains were gold and endless and entirely familiar, home in every direction, and nothing about the morning was remarkable except that it was. Harlan's Creek had grown again by 1888, grown enough that there was now a proper school with a hired teacher, a young woman from Missouri named Miss Calvert, who had studied at a normal school, and who came with her own books and a serious commitment to the proposition that frontier children deserved a real education, and not just rudimentary letters and numbers. Emma was one of the people who had argued most strongly for the school at the town council, appearing before them with a clear and documented case for both the need and the funding, and she was the one who had organized the collection among the townspeople that had furnished Miss Calvert's schoolroom with desks and a proper blackboard. When Samuel turned 5 and began attending the school, Emma walked him in on his first morning and met Miss Calvert properly, and the two of them talked for 20 minutes about education, and about what Samuel would need and about the school's curriculum, and Emma came away satisfied in the way she was satisfied when she was confident something was being done properly and by the right person. Timothy was waiting at the wagon when she came out. He looked at her face and said, "Good." "Very good," Emma said. "She knows what she's doing." "Then it's sorted," he said, and handed her up to the wagon seat, and they drove home through the August morning with the dust rising behind them and the sky its full summer blue above. The years took on the particular quality of good years, which is not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of enough that is solid and true to make the difficult things manageable. There were seasons when the wheat was thin and seasons when it was full. There were cattle lost to weather, and cattle born in the good way of strong, healthy animals in good conditions. There were mornings when Emma was tired down to her bones, and there were mornings when she woke before the alarm of habit and lay in the early dark listening to her husband's steady breathing and her children's quiet and the distant sound of the prairie, and felt a gratitude so large and so specific it was almost overwhelming. She thought sometimes of the woman she had been in 1878, standing at the kitchen window watching the sun rise, and thinking the world was beautiful and cruel. That woman had not been wrong. The world was still both of those things, but she had learned over everything that followed that the beautiful and the cruel were not equal in weight. The beautiful could hold more. If you let it, if you kept adding to it, it could hold more than you ever thought possible. In the fall of 1889, Kansas became a fully organized state, which it had been officially since 1861, but which in the practical reality of the western portion felt more present now, more settled, the frontier character of the place shifting slowly towards something that could be called community in a more permanent sense. Timothy went to vote in the first proper state election and came back thoughtful, and said to Emma that he thought the country was changing faster than most people could entirely track. And Emma agreed and said that some of the changes were long overdue and some needed watching. And they talked about it at the kitchen table in the way they talked about everything, seriously and honestly, and without the need for one of them to arrive at the conversation with all the right answers already formed. In 1890, their daughter Clara started school. She went with her brother Samuel on her first morning and turned in the doorway of the schoolroom to give her mother a look of complete confidence that had nothing in it of nervousness or uncertainty. And Emma looked back at her and thought, "There you are," and felt a love so fierce it was almost like pain. Samuel had been reading for 2 years by then, with a focus and appetite that delighted Miss Calvert and periodically astonished his parents, though it should not have because both of them were readers when they had time, which Emma's father had been as well. The Walker homestead, expanded now to the Walker Archer Ranch, had a small collection of books that had grown by careful addition over the years, novels and histories and a farming almanac, and a medical reference that Emma had purchased from a catalog, and which she had actually read through thoroughly, being Emma Walker Archer, and therefore taking her responsibilities seriously. Young James, who was 2 and had opinions about everything, had not yet formed a view on school but had formed very firm views on horses, dogs, and the injustice of being told he was too small to do things that his older siblings were permitted to do. He was constantly in motion, exhausting to watch, and possessed of such absolute physical confidence in himself that Timothy said he would either be the best horseman in western Kansas by the time he was 12, or he would give his parents entirely gray hair before that. Emma thought both things were likely. On a March evening in 1891, when the children were in bed and the house was quiet, and the last of the winter was doing its final cold work outside, Emma and Timothy sat by the fire in the way they always did, and Emma looked at her husband's face in the firelight and thought about the question she had never stopped thinking about, the one he had asked her in a hotel dining room on an ordinary Tuesday in May 1882. Over bad coffee that she would have given anything to taste again because it had been the coffee she had been drinking when everything changed. "Who takes care of you?" "Timothy," she said. He looked up from the fire. "Do you know what I think about sometimes?" "Tell me," he said, which was what he always said, the invitation he had always extended from that first coffee to this last fire of winter. "I think about who I was before," she said, "and who I am now and the distance between them." He looked at her steadily. "Are you happy with the distance?" "I am not just happy with it," Emma said. "I am grateful for every step of it, even the hard ones, especially the hard ones." She paused. "You asked me once who took care of me. I think I told you no one." "You did," he said. "I want to tell you something else," she said, "now that I've had time to think about it." She looked at him across the fire, this man who had come into her life like a door opening after a long time in the dark. "I learned to take care of myself. That was the first thing, and I am glad I know how, because knowing how is not the same as having to do it alone, and you are the person who taught me the difference." Timothy was quiet for a moment. The fire popped and sent a small shower of sparks up the chimney. "I think you knew most of that already," he said. "Before me." "Maybe," Emma said. "But knowing something and believing it are not always the same thing." He reached across and took her hand, the way she had taken his on the porch in the dark all those years ago, the same way, the warmth of it and the certainty of it identical to that first time and every time since. "I believe it," he said. "About you. I have believed it since the first morning." Outside, the March wind was doing the last of its winter business across the Kansas plains, moving the dry grass in long, slow waves that would be green in 6 weeks, would be gold in 6 months, would be this same winter bronze in 6 months after that. The great turning of the year going on as it always had and always would. The world beautiful and large and entirely present around the edges of this house, this fire. These two people who had found each other against all reasonable expectation and had chosen, every day since, to stay found. Spring came in April as it always did, and with it, the work of planting and the return of the meadowlarks to the fence posts and the gradual warming of the soil that the garden waited for. Emma planted the garden with Clara helping in the way children help, serious and enthusiastic and not always accurate. Samuel was in the barn with his father, doing whatever needed doing there with the focused competence that was increasingly his character. And James was on the porch being supervised by Pete's wife, who came sometimes to help, because Pete and his family had moved back to the area, and the two families had become thoroughly intertwined in the practical and affectionate way of frontier neighbors who have chosen each other. Timothy came out of the barn in the late afternoon with Samuel close behind him, and the two of them walked across the yard to where Emma was in the garden, and Samuel veered off to find Clara and James, and Timothy came and stood at the edge of the garden and looked at Emma among her plants in the late afternoon light. "Good day," he said. "Very good day," Emma said, and looked up at him, this man she loved, in the light that was going golden over the flat edge of the world. "Yours." "The best kind," he said, "the ordinary kind." She smiled at him, the full smile, her own version of it, and he smiled back. And the light moved across everything the way light does in Kansas in the spring, as though it has all the time in the world and knows exactly how beautiful it is, making the ordinary things it touches. And there they were, Emma Walker Archer and Timothy Archer on their land in their life, with their children's voices carrying across the yard in the late afternoon, with the whole of the Kansas sky above them and the whole of what they had built together surrounding them in every direction. Not a fairy tale. Better than that. A real life, fully chosen, fully lived, fully theirs. The homestead her father had built, that her mother had planted with elm trees, that Emma had held onto through 4 years of difficulty and grief and solitude, was a ranch now, a home in the fullest sense. The question that had changed her life had been answered, and the answer, as it turned out, was not just one person but the whole shape of a life that had room for both of them, room for their children and their work and their ordinary, extraordinary days. Who takes care of you? We take care of each other. That was the answer. It had always been the answer. It had just taken a cowboy with warm brown eyes, and a horse named Clara, and a cup of very bad coffee to ask the right question at the right moment and make it visible. Emma stood up from her garden and brushed the dirt from her hands and walked to where her husband was standing at the edge of the yard, and she took his hand, and together they watched their children play in the late gold of the April afternoon, on the plains that went on forever in every direction, under the Kansas sky that was bigger than any trouble and more beautiful than any fear, and everything that had ever been broken was healed, and everything that had ever been uncertain was settled. And everything that had ever been lost had been, in one way or another, replaced by something new. This was the life. This, exactly and entirely, was the life.